Hello, everyone, and welcome to our following Learner-Centered Principles for More Equitable Online Teaching author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I am the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce Phyllis Blumberg, author of Making Learning-Centered Teaching Work, and Kevin Kelly, co-author of Advancing Online Teaching. Making Learning-Centered Teaching Work is the substantially expanded and enhanced second edition of the best-selling textbook, Developing Learner-Centered Teaching, A Practical Guide for Faculty, published in 2009. In this interactive session, we will discuss 12 essential learning-centered actions described in the book. These learning-centered teaching actions are integrated with the community of inquiry model, a commonly used framework in online education. Our authors will focus on answering your questions about how to implement learning-centered principles for more equitable teaching in online, hybrid, and in-person environments. Phyllis Blumberg is a consultant and presenter focusing on the learning process, assessment of student learning outcomes, and effective teaching in higher education. From 1999 to 2019, she was the director of the Teaching and Learning Center at the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. Kevin Kelly teaches online courses as a lecturer in the Department of Equity, Leadership Studies, and Instructional Technologies at San Francisco State University, where he has also served as online teaching and learning manager. So welcome to both of our authors today.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about learning-centered principles to have more equitable online teaching. And this is going to be a highly interactive session. So we have a small enough crowd, people can ask questions in the chat. We'll be stopping to answer questions. So the objectives for this session will be, first of all, to discuss learning-centered principles and how they work in face-to-face, hybrid, flexible, and online learning environments, and what are the essential things that you need to do to make it work well. We're going to be implementing learning-centered teaching through the lens of community of inquiry, which is a model that's been used a lot in online education. And then we're going to be sharing an awful lot of examples, our examples, your examples, tools and strategies for what works and doesn't work. I just want to put a little caveat here that what works in one institution with one type of students may or may not work with another institution and with a different type of students. So as you hear these examples, keep in mind and say to myself, would it work with my population? Would it work at my university? Many of them can be adapted, many of them can be tweaked somewhat, but just be thinking that this is not a one-size-fits-all. As we all know, education is not. So we promised that this would be a highly interactive session. So we're going to start with a poll. And we have 4 things that we would like you to, 4 levels: learning-centered teaching in online environments. How much do you know about or use learning-centered teaching in online environments? So here's 4 choices for you, and we can put the poll up now.
Here we go. And it looks like we have a pretty big range with people more on the growth area side, people who have tried and want to level up, people who want to learn more, but there are plenty out there, over a third, who see this as a strength area where they use learning-centered teaching strategies and they use them even in their online teaching. And for those of you who use them regularly and want to share, that chat is all warmed up for you.
Mm-hmm. And I suspect that the people could be modest and we could have more people in the strength area. So I am going to assume that you know a little bit about this. So I'm just going to go over some of the myths and truths associated with learning-centered teaching. So these are the myths that are commonly associated with learning-centered teaching. I've heard this from chairs, I've heard this from faculty, I've heard this from students even, and I'm going to tell you why these myths are not true. The first one is, when you use learning-centered teaching, you're not sacrificing rigor. In fact, you're adding rigor, and we're helping the students to learn on their own, which is an increased rigor in itself. And the second myth is, by now, after this concept was introduced in 1995, hard to imagine it's been so many years ago now, it's been successfully used in teaching a huge range of student populations, all levels of higher education, from developmental education, pre-college courses, all the way through professional and courses. It's been used in every college and discipline all over the world too. Myth 3, oftentimes student evaluations take a turn for the worst when you try something new, and it's usually because when you try something new, you're not as polished as the second or third time you do it. But it's also the idea that you need to prepare students for doing learning-centered teaching. Many students don't have the right expectations, and once they have the right expectations that they will be more involved, they can't sleep until midterms and then sleep again until finals. And then those students become more accepting and really understand why they're learning differently and engaging more. There are many ways, myth number 4, there are many ways to teach learning-centered teaching, and we're going to be talking about different implementations today. And then the 5th one is that you have to embrace it. It's an all or nothing type of thing. And I have always made a point of saying, no, it's an incremental thing. People can move along and start one thing, and then as they mature, they can embrace learning-centered teaching more and more, and then it becomes a philosophy and an all-encompassing pedagogical endeavor. So the truth's the opposite of the myths. It can be applied to all different venues. It promotes more equitable online teaching, and I hope by the end of this session, you'll see how and why that happens. And it engages students with content and with others in the course on a regular and ongoing basis, which is one of the key points that you really need to do when you're teaching it online. You can't let the students slip away and not be engaged. So with learner-centered teaching, the students are learning who are learning remotely. They are able to be more engaged, more motivated. They want to improve because you're giving them more feedback. They're making meaning out of the content, and they're engaged in the choices. And one of the things that I was particularly encouraged about in the research is that learning-centered teaching actually leads to better results with students coming from non-traditional and non-motivated students. And it was a surprise to me when I heard that, because I had heard for so many years, only the honor students can do this, or we can only do this with with upper level students. And it's actually because we're more engaged with the students, and the students are more engaged with their learning, that they do better. The students will be working harder, and the students will be more committed. And once they realize that they are really learning and not just passively going through this, generally they're very accepting, and they want all of their courses to be that way. So all of the principles that I'm going to be talking about today are, they apply equally to hybrid, online, face-to-face type of environments, and but I think in the online environment, they take on even more importance. So I have decided, after reviewing the literature and looking through what I've written, there are 12 learning-centered teaching principles that are essential for online learning. And I just want you to take a moment to take a look at these. And if you have a question about a word or two, a vocabulary type of issue, can you put it in the chat, please?
And then Phyllis, for universal design for learning strategy of providing the information in multiple formats, do you want to quickly give an overview of what's in each box?
Well, we'll do that probably in a minute or two when we break them down. Rather than the 12, we'll be breaking them down into 2 groups.
That sounds perfect. Thanks.
But are there vocabulary questions right now? Or concepts? Anything in the chat?
Not yet. I think you probably can move ahead and share with people the
Right.
different chunks.
So there's 3 principles that are consistent regardless of format, and then the others I think take on an increased importance. Backwards design is where you start from the end of where you want the students to be at the end of the course. You plan your learning outcomes, and then you plan the rest of the course. Organizing schemes are what experts use in a field to understand that discipline. So things are all together into a scheme as opposed to isolated factoids. and fair, objective, and consistent assessment policies and standards. You make them, you use them consistently with all your students. It's a way of being fair to all your students as opposed to having favoritism. And this is particularly important when you're talking about students who feel marginalized in higher education. They often feel as if they were not treated objectively, or they were not treated the same as other students. So now there are the following other rest of them, which are 9 remaining ones, which I think take on greater importance or need a little bit of adjustment in online education. So to go over these 9, we're talking about the concept of course alignment. Is the idea that the content of the course is aligned in the objectives, the assessment, and how the students learn or their practice, as well as the cognitive expectations for the students, like what do you expect them to be able to do. Clear, organized course design. I think anybody who's been teaching would know that a course that's well organized is easier to teach from and easier for the students to learn from. The role of the teacher primarily is to facilitate student learning. Certainly in an online environment, just plain lecturing will not be very effective. And we want to make sure we create a successful, oriented, and supportive environment. So we want to make sure the students know that we care about them and we want them to succeed, but that doesn't mean we're going to be super easy or give them A's. Providing a scaffolding support. If you think of scaffolding in construction industry, it's a support that you put in place, you help them out, and then you take it away. Provides meaningful student engagement with the content. We want the students to really make their own meaning of the content, to understand what it means, to relate it to their own lives or their future careers. Formative feedback is feedback that's intended for improvement. Give students varied opportunities to learn. This is even more important in an online environment. You don't want them to just reading. You want them to be reading, seeing, doing, talking. Providing a learning-centered syllabus and LMS. A learning-centered syllabus really has the perspective of learning in mind, as opposed to not just talking about what the instructor will do. It's easy to find where things are. Sometimes you even build in redundancy. You might want to put a graphic in there to help people see the whole picture, and allowing some flexibility in policies and practices. This is particularly important during COVID, and when students may have issues about technology access. So now we want to ask you, which of the 12 learning-centered principles interest you the most? And we've put highlighting it in yellow, the key words, and now we're going to have another poll.
And go behind the poll, since this is only 1 hour and there's so much content to cover, we want to focus on the areas where you all have the most interest. And obviously you'll be able to get the book to learn about all of them, but in our session today, we want to make sure we're covering the topics that you're working on right now.
Student engagement is clearly one that we need to talk about,
as well as learning opportunities, teacher roles, and formative feedback. Okay, I've made a note of those.
Right.
So maybe we start with engagement, since that had the highest amount of interest.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to be giving lots of examples of how you can engage students online. The first one I'm going to talk about is meaningful discussions. And this is an idea that if you have a class that's in a hybrid format, or you have some synchronous classes, start your discussion in a synchronous format, and then you can divide the students into small groups to talk about issues, and then continue the discussion in a discussion board remotely after class. So you might want to post a key question to start the discussion board. And I have found that some students contribute more in class and when they're talking, and some students contribute more on the discussion board. And it might have to do with language. It might have to do with some people like to talk, some people like to think and process first. But both of those, both the oral discussion and the discussion boards are really excellent ways for students to express themselves. And they can contribute in different ways. So that's just thinking about how you can have discussions. And
Let me chime in there, Phyllis. The synchronous discussions, there's an equity strategy that we promote that involves something that you could do in a classroom as well. And that's creating a stack of index cards or some way to make sure that you're calling on every student as opposed to just the vocal speakers, because some people are quick to turn on their microphone. You have those dominant talkers in your classes. And so by letting every student know at the beginning of the semester or quarter, depending on your campus, that you're going to be calling on everybody. And it's okay if they don't have the correct answer or the full answer. Mistakes are actually welcome because that's how we learn. But then you're calling a name off the stack, and that helps students get ready so they come to class prepared if it's a synchronous session. And if they don't have the complete answer, you can go to the next card on the stack. Like some of us who are a little bit older, remember that show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? It's like a phone a friend where the next person on the stack can help them finish the answer, and it becomes a way to make it more equitable for class participation.
Okay, thank you. Another suggestion that works equally well in all environments is to make the content relevant for students. And this is one of my very favorite examples that I read about. This was a professor of Bible at a secular university, and Bible studies was a liberal arts college. It was a liberal arts type of thing. So it was not like a pre-seminary or anything of this nature. And he taught a course on Psalms. And he thinks students took it because they thought it was going to be an easy course. But when they got to the course and they studying Psalms, they turned off and they just said, Psalms are like poetry. I'm not interested. And if you teach poetry, many times you find students are just not at all interested. And what he did was he made the course relevant. He used video clips and music to show how Psalms and poetry are really much like aspects of our culture. They talk about love and beauty and nature, loss, very much like common culture does, very much like music does. So that's an idea that got the students very interested in this. And then how you would implement the idea of making it relevant in an asynchronous environment. You ask the students to find these video clips or music, popular culture, media that remind them of a specific psalm theme or poetry. And then the peers can comment on the specific comparisons to popular music. Maybe it's a genre that they don't know very much about. And then the peers can critique each other. And this can be done in a completely asynchronous environment. So that's a way that I just think is a great way of getting students particularly engaged. And I read an article in, I think it was Higher Education Today, that basically said there's a lot of students that are turned off, they're disconnected. So the more that we can get students connecting through what is their lives, the better it'll be for all of us.
And I've got one more thing to add to that idea. There's a technology called Flipgrid, and some people use VoiceThread as ways for students to take that idea of posting video clips or media and bring it into discussions, because some students prefer to talk rather than type. You can ask students to create a 1 or 2 minute video clip instead of a text passage to respond to each other in the discussion forum, and just provide a link to the Flipgrid. Flipgrid's automatically captioned, just like this Zoom session is being captioned. If you want to turn on the transcript, you can. And so thinking about ways that we can increase the number of pathways for students to show what they know in the online environment is a really great idea. So pulling the fantastic strategies from this slide into every other type of interaction and student engagement is something that we encourage.
Thank you. Another way to get students engaged with the content is something that's called a reading retention strategy. And this works particularly well with more difficult material, and it helps the students to understand the material. You expect the students to read the assignment on their own in advance, and they can either come to class or they can do this in a synchronous environment where they come to a meeting, and then they work in pairs to compare their answers. So you give them you ask the students to answer questions in advance, and they compare their answers. They can modify their answers, and this can be easily done remotely. Students have great ways of collaborating, and maybe we could talk about a way or two that students can collaborate before we go on, like asynchronously or not without the teacher being there.
You bet. And so if you've seen Hypothesis or eMargin, different tools for what's called social reading or collaborative annotation, you can actually have students engage around a text asynchronously and learn from each other. The instructor can also put prompts along the way so that the students know what they should be thinking about as they go through a passage of text. Often as instructors, we might just give students a bullet list of pages to read or lists of links of journal articles to go find and read, but we're not giving them enough context of what we're hoping that they'll get out of that, giving them structure, especially for first generation students who may not be accustomed to certain reading assignments. And so allowing them to use a tool like Hypothesis or eMargin or other social reading tools allows them to ask questions of their peers, see what other students are highlighting as important and compare it to what they're finding important, and it gives them some additional pathways for content review. This can also be done for other types of media like video or audio. So SoundCloud has audio options to basically tag a portion of audio and write comments about it. And there are tools like Video Ant and others that allow you to do that with video.
Great, thank you. So a way that you could use this in your own asynchronous environment would be if you're asking the students to read material that's difficult, you post students questions that they must upload their answers. And then you ask the students to work together in pairs to compare their answers. And this can be done completely out of class, asynchronously. They find their own time when they would meet and talk, or they could even write to each other without it being a talk type of thing. And then they would revise their answers, and then they would receive a new problem. And as two people together, they would then respond to the new problem or a new situation, a real world situation, or something more difficult. And they would work together to discuss their answers. And then they can hand in their answer, and that can count as a participation grade. It can count as homework. It can count any way you want it to do. And then you want to rotate the peers every couple of weeks, because some students are better readers than others, and some students are better writers. So exposing students to as many different peers as they possibly can, they learn a lot from their peers. And the next example is something that I thought was a very, very clever example, using collaborative learning, small group note-taking. And this is a very low stakes thing. This was used in a Spanish class, but you could be using it in any type of environment where you're using difficult vocabulary, complex concepts. It could be in STEM classes. Students take notes from the class, and in the Spanish class, it was a fairly low-level Spanish class, and the teacher was teaching in Spanish, and the students had to take their notes in Spanish. And that was very, very stressful for the students, because they couldn't understand, they didn't understand the vocabulary well enough, they weren't processing quickly enough, and they weren't able to write in Spanish. And this could come from a lecture, it could come from a presentation, it could come from reading. And then in small groups, students compare their notes, they correct their mistakes, they find out, oh, I missed, the teacher said 4 points and I only got 3 points. They can add their 4th point in there, and then they create a set of notes, and that is a better set of notes or a master notes. And then that can be graded as part of class participation.
And there are plenty of tools out there for this. And I know people are used to the Google Suite, Google Docs and Google Slides and things like that, but you can also use OneNote and other tools equally well for students to collaboratively author and take notes in class. You can also have a rotating basis for students to be the one in charge of taking notes and then have others chime in with things that they feel need to be inserted because they might have been left out. And there are some note-taking techniques like 2-column note-taking, visualizations related to note-taking that all can be accomplished with different technologies and apps.
So you pretty much said what I had up on the slide. They can watch a recorded lecture, they can take notes, upload it using various technologies. So now I want to ask if there's anybody here who has things they'd like to share about how they get students engaged in online classes.
And just recalling, Jess Clausen shared that she has a Nearpod discussion board going all the time during class so that students have the option to unmute themselves and speak or type their comment, and it can be anonymous to their other classmates, but not to the teacher. And that seems to work pretty well in general, but usually don't call on students directly. So it's a different way of engaging students, but it looks like it works too.
Great.
And Jennifer Kelly uses Mentimeter, shared Google Docs, and Google Jamboard and Nearpod. So Mary Lawrence uses social media reading response activities where they compose tweets in Twitter, tagging the authors of the book for her English course. Some clever strategies out there.
Yeah. Okay. In the interest of time, we're already halfway through the hour. I'm going to not cover more of the top ones that you said because I want to get to the next point, and then we'll cover at least one more of them. So we said we were going to be taking these 12 key actions or principles and putting them into the framework of community of inquiry, because community of inquiry, this framework is very widely used in online education. And if you can understand what this says is that the three, they have called them presences. You've got the cognitive presence, you've got the social presence, and you've got the teaching presence. And this is a Venn diagram. And when you put them together, you have the ability to engage with content, engage with participants, and engage with roles and direction. And when you have that, a really good community of inquiry, you have an excellent educational experience. You've supported discourse, you've set the climate for success, and you've regulated learning. So now I'm going to divide each of these three presences, or I'm going to put the 12 processes into the three presences. So the cognitive presence talks about engagement with the content. And we already talked about one of these promotes meaningful student engagement with the content. But the other three is talking about course alignment. And that's the idea that the content of the course in terms of the objectives, the assessment, and the student learning activities are all aligned cognitively, and it's covering the same content. Explicitly using organizing schemes, and that's a very interesting way of teaching a course that's not necessarily topical, the way most people think about it, and giving students varied opportunities to learn. The second one is teaching presence. And this is how the teacher plans the course, what the teacher does. So it would be backwards design starting from the end, an organization that's clear and, most important, explicit to the students. The roles of the teacher are to facilitate student learning and to help the student to succeed. And then we talked about clear assessment policies. This is what this teacher does, provides formative feedback. And I know that's one that people were interested in learning about, and provides an LMS that's learner-centered. And then the last one is social presence, and that's engagement with the participants, providing a scaffolding learning environment. And I added one here that's not one of the essential ones that I had earlier, and that's building rapport, because rapport is much more important in an online environment and allows some flexibilities in policies and practices. And now we want to know which of the three presences would you like to vote? Would you like to hear more about?
We'll pop up a poll for you to share what you think, what you're interested in pursuing. And it looks like cognitive presence wins by just a little bit.
Okay. Cognitive presence it will be. All right, the 4 aspects of cognitive presence. One we've already covered, which is promotes meaningful engagement with the student. So with the student engagement with the content, rather. But the one that I really want to focus on is organizing schemes, because to me, this can completely turn your course around. And it takes some thought in terms of how to do it. But I have seen remarkable results in both online and face-to-face courses. So what is an organizing scheme? And I have a couple of pictures up here. The periodic table of elements in chemistry is probably the most famous periodic scheme, because everybody who's ever taken a course in chemistry knows that the elements on the periodic table are placed there because of the row and column that they're in. So that puts so much information about chemistry together right there. The ways that books are classified in libraries is also 2 organizing schemes. K through 12 use the Dewey Decimal System. Most universities, libraries use the Library of Congress, and that's a way of putting that whole huge, vast universe of what is knowledge and what we write books about on shelves so people can find them. In most disciplines, content can be summarized in about 12 or less organizing schemes. And that would mean 90% of what you think of in the discipline can be put in that scheme. And the difference between a novice and an expert is a novice doesn't have these organizing schemes because it takes years of study and realizing and learning before you get it, whereas an expert has it. And if we can jumpstart the students to give them the organizing schemes right away, then we can help them organize their knowledge and learn much better.
And I would say that those organizing schemes are fractal, right, Phyllis? So you have them in the discipline, but you can also have them in your course. And the strategy that I use in my online classes is a simple numbering system. Each module is got a number, and then each element in that module has a sub number. So 1.1, 1.2 helps students see which activities go with which readings, especially when the list might be longer than you want them to be, and allows you to chunk information according to those organizing schemes.
And if you're teaching an advanced course, you may only be focusing on 1 or 2 organizing schemes within an entire discipline. If you're teaching that intro course, it's oftentimes you have to teach a topic or 2 out of every single one of the organizing schemes. So just to give you a couple of examples of what organizing schemes are, I put them up on the screen, and this has come from the many different faculty members that I have worked with over the years who have thought about this and thought about what the organizing schemes are. And it's a difficult concept at first, but once you get it, it makes a lot of sense. So some of them are really pithy, like in finance: maximize profit, minimize risk. Music is the art form where medium is the medium is sound. Very pithy, whereas in some of them, they're not as pithy. So what I want you to do now is take a minute or 2 and think about the organizing schemes in your discipline, and just put your discipline into the chat and 1 or 2 organizing schemes.
And what's interesting while people type in the chat, Phyllis, is that I know some people will use that organizing scheme as the construct for a graphic syllabus.
Yes.
So that they might, Bandana put biology in the chat. And so you might use the cell structure as the organization for your course, and use that graphic of a picture of a cell or maybe a cell dividing as a way to show what students are going to learn that semester. So
right.
I love how this can turn into many different things. So Kathy talks about leadership. Susan Kahn talks about how history can be organized by era or time period or cause and effect. Kathy says maybe leadership styles, question mark. And some of the organizational leadership and behavior courses, I know leadership styles can provide different ways of looking at the world, for sure.
So once you have these organizing schemes, then you start to plan your course around the organizing schemes. So this is the way that you're going to teach your course, the way you're going to organize the content. It's going to be the way of really helping you put everything together. And that's what I said on the next slide. Textbooks are rarely organized by organizing schemes, which is why students don't learn organizing schemes. Instead, textbooks are usually organized by topics which may not relate to organizing schemes, or they may use several of them. So if you graphically represent your organizing schemes, then you can then start to think about, what do I want them to be able to learn in each one of them. So instead of textbooks, you might want them to be reading different readings from different things. It might be essays, it might be more tertiary material rather than, secondary rather than a textbook, but you're going to have a very different way of thinking about your course. So I'm going to give you an example of what I think is a really clever way. Most history of theater courses are taught starting with ancient Greece and moving forward. And as a result, students see it as very isolated and not integrated, not connected at all. Caitlin Wood presents themes in her course, and she organizes her entire course around these organizing schemes, and they transcend genres and they transcend time. So for example, her schemes are theater and the state, performance and spirituality, transnational identities, power and control, and politics and style and form. And if you think about that, if you know anything about theater, that's going to get you to be thinking much more about, gee, I just went to the theater 2 weeks ago. I saw Man for All Seasons, which is a remake of a movie from a long time ago. It's a political thing. It's talking about power and control. Totally. So that would be one that I would think would be a great theater piece to put into a power and control type of thing. And then you start thinking about that particular play that you saw or read, and you say, oh, I see it in a very different way. And then she has them connecting themes and genres together into her schemes. And her students have loved how she teaches. And she wrote this article just about the time of presidential elections, and the students started to see the presidential elections definitely relating to theater and the state. So how you can implement this in an online synchronous or an asynchronous environment using that theater example again, you would have the student, you would give the students some information about the organizing schemes and how they relate, and then you would you would have the students working together in a jigsaw format. And I just want to spend a minute talking about what the jigsaw looks like, in which you ask students to, in a homogeneous group, discuss one play. So it might be, you would have them read 4 plays according to one of these organizing schemes. So you would have 4 groups, and one group would talk about play 1, one group would talk about play 2, etc. And then you have 10 minutes for them to review what they're talking about. And then at the end of 10 minutes, you put everybody together into heterogeneous groups. So now there's 4 different plays that are represented, and now you give them a question. How does this relate to the organizing scheme? Do you see similarities between them? Do you see differences between them? How does the historical context or the culture influence the plays? So you're asking them to really think more about it. So questions about organizing schemes.
We do have a good one in the chat, and I'm hoping some of the participants will help us answer it. Vandana wants to know, how would I organize my environmental biology course, which integrates biology, economics, ethics, geology, and more?
That's a great question.
Well, I could see one thing being a Venn diagram where you put environmental biology in the center and then have 4 or more circles that show the different things that contribute to that field. And then the analogy that I often use, it's like going to the eye doctor, where they put different lenses in front of your eyes and say, is it clearer or fuzzier or neither? And so by using all of these lenses to get a better picture of your discipline, then you can end up with students thinking about the field in a different way, because there are just so many ways to contribute to our knowledge and understanding and application of what we learn.
And I was thinking in a different way. I was thinking of using a series of case studies that you would ask the students to analyze, given the 4 different major components. So you give them the Venn diagram of this is the organizing scheme of environmental biology. And then you would give them a case study in which they would analyze it according to the major components of the Venn diagram. So each case study would be different and they would be seeing how they compare and contrast.
And then we have a question from Susan Kahn about what's our favorite tool for creating infographics. So Susan, it depends if your infographic is going to involve data or not. I'm a fan of PictoChart, which is Pikto. That one makes pretty good charts. Canva, as Mary points out, is another good one. And then in some cases, you can actually use PowerPoint. And there's a tool that allows you to turn the slides into one long document. So there's a lot of things out there, but really it's about information chunking and also accessibility, because sometimes the infographics that get generated may not be accessible for students with screen readers. So you'll definitely want to check that out if the PDF that results from that tool is not accessible.
Any other questions that we should cover?
No, it looks like everything else is smooth and clear. So keep on going.
Great. So I want to cover one more aspect of this presence, and that's the cognitive presence of giving students varied opportunities to learn. And this is important in all education, but I think it becomes so much more important with remote education. You want to encourage students to think beyond those grades. How many times have students said to you, does this count for the grade? How many points is this? Can I get extra credit? And that's what we've done in higher education in America, and probably in education in general, is we've made the grade the end product, but learning has to be the end product. So if we can give students opportunities to think beyond the grades and to focus on grades. And in my experience, I find that when students realize that learning is the key and learning is the end product, they rarely miss class. This happened to me many years ago, but this was long before we had anything online education. A student in my class broke her leg, and I was teaching in medical school, so we were teaching close to the hospital. And she actually had her leg up in traction, and she said, could you guys, it was a small enough class, come to my hospital room and take the class so that I can be part of the class. And here she was, probably on painkillers, wanting to participate in the class. So we all piled into her hospital room, and we all held her class for about a week while she was in the hospital. But that to me was such an example of a student who really wanted to learn, and we would have made accommodations for her grades, but that wasn't the important thing at all.
And we have an interesting comment in the chat that I'd love to reply and see what other people think. Amy says, I'm not a fan of extra credit. If they couldn't do the work that's assigned, why provide extra? And Vandana agrees. I'll provide a counterpoint to consider, and that is that especially these days for students who didn't choose to take online courses, but were forced to because of the shift to remote teaching. And I know we're in the process of shifting back at many campuses, but many courses are still online. Considering that students may not have access to a device, surveys have shown that almost 25% of students don't have regular, reliable access to a computer. So they may be using a smartphone or borrowing from friends or neighbors to get assignments done. Students may be dealing with other obligations like a job, children, or adults who need caregiver attention, and other factors, food and housing insecurity being others. Providing students with opportunities to show what they know in multiple ways, kind of like triangulation for research, where we give students multiple opportunities to show what they know. Maybe rather than extra credit, Amy, you can think about having more assignments that they need for the grade, and they can drop 1 or 2 because life gets in the way, kind of thing. And it looks like you're doing that already with flexibility for the deadline. So that's another way to support students where they are, is allow them more time. And it seems like we've got some different strategies popping up in the chat. Mary saying always have optional extra credit for writing assignments, where the student can augment their essays by creating multimodal components. And Mary, I do the same thing, and I actually make the draft of the essay the first stage, and then students choose what's the final format you want to be for this work. So that way they've created an outline and a draft of their written work, but then they can convert it into an infographic, a video, a presentation of some sort. And basically they gain digital literacy skills, but they've also constructed their argument in a way that will support them with rhetoric and writing.
I have a
Neat.
Slightly different idea about extra credit. I see learning opportunity. If it's a learning opportunity where the student who may not have done well on a previous unit can go back and relearn that material and demonstrate competence, then I think it's appropriate. I certainly don't think it's appropriate for a student who's failing the course to be able to get a B or even an A if there's too much extra credit. But I see it as a way of coming back and learning something. And I know lots of extra credit ways that really work very, very well to help students to learn. So I think we have to be flexible ourselves in how we're thinking about what we're doing, how we're grading students, and our expectations of students in these times, but also be thinking, well, is extra credit a learning opportunity? And if it is, then it's not so bad. So I have on the screen a number of ways that you can think about different ways of having students learn to foster their own participation and their own engagement, and handing in drafts for feedback. I've used this technique a few times. I say to the students, if you're going to hand me in a draft, and this is a draft usually is a paper, but it could be of something else. And if I think it's like an A- type level already, I'll say to the students, you don't have to do the final draft, because the time that it would take you to go from an A- to an A is not worth it. You already got it. And that can motivate students to do a good draft early, particularly if they've got a heavy course load and they want to finish one course before another. So another way that you might encourage students to be thinking about everything as a learning opportunity is to present students with a decision tree in which you're giving them the consequences of taking advantage of this or not taking advantage of this. And for every activity in the class, you have them decide, if I participate, how can I learn? When I participate, how can I learn? And if I don't participate, what will I have missed? So that helps students to see that they are doing things that really relate to learning, and there's a purpose for all of this.
And I would add to that the transparent assignment template from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Marianne Winklemas, allows students to see why they're doing each activity, the purpose of it, and that helps first generation students especially make decisions about which assignments they want to complete. I know that, again, when we moderated a panel of students, the 19-year-old was gung-ho to complete every assignment, but the 35-year-old mother of 2 who worked full-time said that she had to make decisions about which assignments to complete, and sometimes things like discussions seemed like it was okay to get a B that week because she just didn't have time to actually complete it all. So giving people a sense of the value of the activity for the learning, how it contributes to the learning outcome, what skills they might gain for the workforce, what personal benefits they might derive, in addition to all these great things that Phyllis has put on the slide, pairing the course activity with questions that get students thinking about the activities is really important.
And the last thing that I'd like to suggest is that you think about implementing high impact practices that align with the course. And a high impact practice can be a service learning project that the students can do in their own community. It could be a service learning project that if they're on campus, it can be in the campus community. Collaborative projects even can be done remotely. And then working with the faculty on a research project, if at all possible, maybe analyzing data or doing some things that they can do on their own, are great ways for students to really learn an awful lot more than the content of the course. So think about that in terms of, it's just because we're doing an online environment doesn't mean we should eliminate high impact practices. So we are almost out of time, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers. So questions, please put them in the poll in the chat.
Or if you're a fan of using your voice, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you.
And it could be quicker.
I see a hand up. It looks like Jessica Z.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, Phyllis. Thanks for letting me jump in here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Great. One thing I think is, you both touched upon, and it is so important, is giving a student something to walk away with. Really tying that into, I mentioned the PBL because a lot of students are especially in the community college, are really looking at, as well as the university, are really looking to see, okay, how does this class tie into my career? What am I taking away from this class that's valuable, that's an asset, right? And I've been working with faculty to tie in PBL as well as outside events, but inside the classroom PBL, so that they're taking away some sort of project or an artifact that they can use later in their career. And it's been really successful so far. And we've been able to tie it into like weekend sprint projects at the community college. So it's a lot of fun, and the students, kind of like maybe our dissertations or master's thesis, they walk away with something that they can go back and say, oh, this was so challenging and this was so fruitful, and they remember those lessons.
It's a great idea. And I would also encourage you to help the students to create their own portfolios of these projects and all the activities that they've done, papers. And that way, when they're applying for jobs or when they're going on to further education, they can use their portfolio in their job interviews. They can use their portfolio as an example. And you forget about all the wonderful things that you've done over the course of several courses, a couple of years. But if you have them develop a portfolio, they can pull it out and they can use it. So it's a fabulous idea, and projects are great things to put into that portfolio. And I just wanted to clarify that PBL in this case is project-based learning. It can also stand for problem-based learning.
Other questions? I see Mandana in the chat. Most times I notice that students don't want to be accountable for the work that's expected from them, and therefore use the practice of asking for extra credit. And for those of you who are watching the recording and may not see the chat, my reply was that sounds like an opportunity to work with students to establish some norms at the beginning of the course. Talk about your philosophy about extra credit and the fact that you want students to be responsible for their learning, and therefore what strategies can you all use together to make sure that it's a meaningful experience where students don't feel like they're doing busy work, but they're driving toward a specific goal, whether that's in biology, maybe their goal is to be a healthcare professional someday, or it's a prerequisite for something else that they have to take. So you can definitely use that as a starting point rather than waiting for students to exhibit those behaviors that you've come to expect. Jess Clausen says, a co-constructed syllabus can go a long way with student buy-in. And you don't have to construct the entire syllabus, right? It can be certain elements about what formats they can submit, or how the online space is going to be a safe space where people, or a brave space, depending on the way you approach it and what your topics are. Other questions? We've got time maybe for one more. And I know we might have the Stylus folks have some announcements about the recording and how to get the book and everything else. From my part, Phyllis, I want to say thank you. I have gained better insights into learning-centered teaching just from this 1 hour. Even though I've read lots about it, you've really distilled some of the core concepts into really recognizable and easy to consume chunks. Thanks.
And I want to thank you, Kevin, for adding all of the insights that you have in use of technologies and platforms and different examples, as well as thanking the audience because the chat has been fabulous. I hope people are paying attention to it. Everybody has such great ideas and so many ways that people can be thinking about it. And we just really scratched the surface. There's a lot more that we can all be talking about and we can be learning from this. And so thank you all. Thank you for giving us an hour of your time.
Great. Patty.
Thank you to Phyllis and to Kevin for sharing their time with us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in live with us this afternoon on Zoom. If you're interested in ordering Making Learning Centered Teaching Work, use code MLCT20 to get 20% off the book and free shipping from Stylus. I will share the link in the code and the code in the chat bar. The webinar video will be available by Friday and shared on all of our Stylus social media accounts. Registrants will also receive a follow-up email with all of the links and downloads shared today. Also visit our Stylus webinar calendar online to check out our upcoming spring webinar events. And if you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. All right, everybody, thank you so much for attending. I will share all of this in the chat. And if we have any last questions, we have maybe a minute or two before we close out the webinar for the day.
Thanks, Patty, and everyone at Stylus for making this possible.
Thank you.